My friend Ethan and I used to go on multi-day backpacking trips all the time. We usually picked routes where the chances of running into other people were close to zero. We liked the isolation. That time, we headed to the northern section of a national park. There was an area where the official trails ended and true backcountry began. To camp there, you needed a special permit. We got ours a month in advance. The ranger at the station told us no one was currently in that sector. The last group had left 4 days earlier. That suited us perfectly. We left the car at a dirt lot and hiked for about 7 hours. The terrain was rough. Fallen trees everywhere, dense underbrush, constant elevation changes. By evening, we found a perfect campsite, a small, flat clearing surrounded by a tight ring of old spruce trees. On one side, there was a steep slope dropping into a ravine. On the other, thick forest, the same way we had come in. We pitched the tent, unpacked our gear, and built a small fire. Darkness fell quickly there. The trees blocked out most of the light, and as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest sank into a heavy, absolute darkness. We had dinner, talked for a bit, and started getting ready for sleep. Ethan went into the tent first. I stayed outside to douse the fire and make sure we hadn't left any food out of the bear canisters. There were bears in the area, and ignoring basic precautions would have been stupid. I checked my watch. 11:40 p.m. I poured the last of the water from the pot onto the coals. A loud hiss cut through the silence. Steam rose and vanished into the dark. I switched my headlamp to its lowest setting, red light. It's easier on the eyes and helps preserve night vision. I took a step toward the tent. A dry twig snapped under my boot. A normal forest sound. But right after that, about 50 feet away, deeper in the woods, I heard the exact same snap. I stopped. At night, the forest has its own rhythm. Animals move around, branches fall. I didn't think much of it. I took 2 more steps over the dry needles and stopped at the tent entrance. From the darkness, again about 50 feet out, came 2 distinct steps. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. I froze. My brain automatically started searching for a logical explanation. Deer can be noisy. They walk over dry branches without caring about stealth. But the rhythm was off. It didn't sound like an animal just moving along. It sounded like weight being placed, on 2 legs. I stood still for about a minute. The forest was silent. Not even the wind moved through the treetops. I told myself I imagined it. Just a coincidence. I leaned down to unzip the rain fly. The sound of the zipper seemed unnaturally loud in that silence. I opened the entrance, tossed my boots inside, and climbed in after them. The moment I zipped it shut, I heard it again outside. A step. Then another. Closer now. Maybe 30 feet from the tent. Ethan was already in his sleeping bag. He wasn't asleep. In the faint glow of my headlamp, I could see his eyes open, reflecting the dim light. He was staring at the tent wall, the direction the sound had come from. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, though he probably couldn't see it clearly. I turned off the light. We were swallowed by complete darkness. "Deer?" he asked quietly. "Probably," I said. I didn't believe it. We lay there in silence. 10 minutes passed. No sound. I started to calm down. Maybe it had just been an animal passing through, drawn by the smell of the dying fire, then heading down into the ravine. I closed my eyes. Then the ground beneath us shifted slightly. It was subtle, but when you're lying on a thin sleeping pad directly on the earth, you feel things like that. Someone had shifted their weight from one foot to the other. Right outside the tent wall. 3 feet from my head. I stopped breathing. Ethan went still too. We both understood, an animal wouldn't behave like that. A bear would huff, sniff loudly, dig around. A deer would snort or stomp. But out there, there was absolute, controlled silence. Whoever was standing there was doing everything possible not to make a sound. They had just shifted their weight. Slowly, trying not to rustle my sleeping bag, I reached toward my backpack. In the side pocket was a hunting knife. My fingers found the cold handle. I gripped it. It gave me a sliver of confidence, but it didn't stop the cold, creeping fear climbing up my spine. Suddenly, Ethan sat up. His sleeping bag rustled loudly. He coughed, on purpose, sharp and deliberate. It was a test. An animal should have been startled and run. A loud noise is the simplest way to scare something off. The response was silence. No pounding hooves. No crashing brush from a retreating bear. Nothing. Whoever was outside didn't move. We stayed like that for about an hour. We didn't talk. We just listened. My legs went numb, but I was too afraid to shift. My mind kept trying to make sense of it. Someone was standing outside our tent. Deep in the wilderness. At midnight. 7 hours of hard hiking from the nearest road. Why? If they wanted to rob us or kill us, they could have done it while we were asleep. Why just stand there and listen to us breathe? After an hour, maybe more, we finally heard something. The person outside started to walk away. Not running. Not fleeing. Slow, measured steps. Step. Pause. Step. Pause. They were heading toward the ravine. The sound faded, step by step, until it disappeared completely. We didn't sleep at all that night. As soon as the forest began to turn gray with morning light, we got out of the tent. We stayed close together. I checked the ground around the campsite. Where there was moss, nothing held. But right behind my side of the tent, about 3 feet from where my head had been, the ground was pressed down. The soil there was damp and bare. There was a clear print. A boot. A human boot. Large. Deep tread, nothing like hiking shoes. Next to it was another. They stood parallel, toes pointed directly at the tent. We packed up camp in record time, 20 minutes. No breakfast. We just stuffed everything into our packs and started back the way we came. We moved fast, constantly looking over our shoulders. I scanned the trees, the shadows, trying to catch any movement. The forest was empty. The worst part, the part that still gets to me, is the realization. Someone had been following us. Matching our pace. Waiting for us to turn off the light. Standing 3 feet away, listening. They could have done anything to us. We were completely defenseless inside that thin nylon shell. But they chose not to. They chose to show us we weren't alone. And that's more terrifying than any direct attack. Because I still don't know why they left. Or if they really left at all. Maybe they just kept moving alongside us, hidden behind the trees, all the way back to the car. Before we move on to the next story, I'd really appreciate it if you dropped a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'm genuinely curious how far these stories reach. It also helps the channel grow. YouTube sees that kind of engagement and pushes the video further. And if you're already enjoying what you're hearing, consider leaving a like. Alright, let's continue. I prefer solo trips. There's a certain aesthetic to them. You control your own pace, depend on no one, adjust to no one. This was late October. I picked a moderate route that was supposed to take 4 days. The trail was old, not very popular, especially that time of year. The weather was overcast, damp. The ground was soaked, covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves, with mud pooling in the low areas. It was the second day of my hike. I planned to cover about 12 miles before sunset. Physically, I felt great. My pack fit well, my boots weren't rubbing. I kept a steady pace, occasionally checking an offline map on my phone. By evening, as the sun began to set, the light in the forest turned dim and gray. That in-between hour, twilight, when shadows stretch and the edges of things lose their definition. I started looking for a place to camp. I needed a flat spot, preferably not too far from water. I was walking along a narrow trail that curved around a large rocky outcrop. The path there was clay-heavy, still wet from recent rain. I kept my eyes on the ground so I wouldn't slip. That's when I saw the footprint. A left boot print, pressed deep into the soft clay, right in the middle of the trail. I stopped and looked at it. There was nothing inherently strange about it. People hike. That's normal. But something about it made me pause. I crouched down for a closer look. The print was completely fresh. The edges of the clay, pushed up by the tread, hadn't settled yet. Murky water was slowly beginning to collect inside the imprint, drop by drop. It couldn't have been more than 5, maybe 10 minutes old. I straightened and looked ahead. The trail continued, winding between trees. I could see maybe 50 yards forward. No one was there. No movement. No sound of breaking branches or rustling fabric. I figured the person was just moving faster than me. Maybe an experienced hiker traveling light. I kept going, picking up my pace. I wasn't trying to catch up, but the idea of someone else being out there, this deep in, always brings a subtle tension. You want to know who's sharing the space with you. I went another half-mile. The twilight deepened. I turned on my headlamp, angling the beam down at the trail. The prints kept appearing. Left. Right. Deep, confident steps. Whoever it was, they were walking straight down the trail. But after a while, I started noticing something off. I was moving fast. Very fast for the end of a hiking day. I should have been gaining on them. But the prints weren't getting fresher. They looked exactly the same. Water just beginning to gather in each one. The distance between us wasn't changing. They were moving at the exact same speed as me. I stopped to drink some water. Slipped one strap of my pack off my shoulder, pulled out my bottle. I stood there for about 5 minutes, catching my breath. The forest was quiet. Just a faint wind moving through bare branches. I capped the bottle, put my pack back on, and continued. There were no more fresh prints. I walked another couple 100 yards. The mud on the trail was perfect for impressions, but all I saw were older, blurred animal tracks. The person was gone. They hadn't stepped off the trail, there were no side paths, no junctions. The tracks just stopped. Right where I had paused to drink. My mind started searching for logic. Maybe they stepped off to relieve themselves, or to set up camp just off trail. I swept my headlamp beam into the trees, scanning the underbrush. No broken branches. No flattened grass. The slope on the left was too steep to climb without leaving deep marks. On the right, dense brush, impossible to move through quietly. I kept walking. Slower now. Listening. Darkness had fully settled. My beam carved a narrow tunnel through the black, picking out tree trunks and the pale ribbon of the trail. I walked for another 30 minutes. Fatigue started creeping in. I decided I'd camp at the first suitable spot. I kept my eyes down. And then the prints appeared again. They didn't emerge from the forest. They just materialized on the trail. First, a partial heel impression. Then a clear right step. Then a left. But they weren't leading forward. They crossed the trail diagonally. From the dense woods on the left, to the right. I stopped. I aimed my light at the place they came from. There was no opening. No gap. Just a solid wall of brush and old deadfall. No one could have moved through that without making noise. And no one could have stood there waiting. I'd been walking in silence for a long time. I would have heard breathing, fabric shifting, something. I looked back at the prints. They were fresh. Perfectly fresh. The clay along the edges glistened in the damp air. That's when it clicked. Someone wasn't just following the same route. Someone was moving parallel to me. Through the forest. In complete darkness. Without a light. They were overtaking me off trail, stepping onto the path just long enough to leave a few prints, then slipping back into the woods. Showing me they were there. That they were controlling my movement. That's when the fear hit, real fear. Not the vague, irrational kind you get from the dark. This was cold, calculated fear. The kind you feel when you realize something out there is physically better than you, better at moving unseen, better at navigating, better at staying hidden. I didn't set up camp. I couldn't bring myself to lie down in a sleeping bag knowing someone was circling outside. I kept walking all night. I drank on the move, ate energy bars without stopping. I didn't pause once. I kept my light pointed at the ground, afraid to lift it, afraid of what I might see standing between the trees. By morning, I reached an intersection with a wider logging road. That's where I managed to hitch a ride with a truck hauling cut timber. The driver asked why I looked so pale. I told him I just hadn't slept. I don't know who was leaving those prints. I don't know how they moved that quietly, or why they never used a light. But I know this. When I glanced back down the trail that night, sometimes the mud behind me, the sections I had just walked through, looked wrong. Like someone was stepping directly into my footprints. Right behind me. My grandfather left me a small fishing cabin on the shore of a remote lake in northern Minnesota. It wasn't a resort, not a vacation community, just a solitary log cabin you could only reach by boat or by taking an old, overgrown service road in a 4x4. I used to go there a couple of times a year just to be alone. To sit in the quiet, read, reset my head. That time, I went in early September. The weather was steady, windless. The lake was like a vast, dark mirror. The water was so still that in the evenings it reflected the stars perfectly. The silence in places like that is different. It's not empty. It's made up of tiny sounds, the faint splash of small fish, the crackle of cooling logs in the walls, the distant call of a night bird. You get used to it quickly. Your brain calibrates to that level of quiet, and any foreign sound feels like an alarm. On the third night of my stay, I went to bed around 11. I latched the door securely, pulled the curtains shut. The cabin was warm from the wood stove. I fell asleep quickly, deeply. I woke up abruptly. No transition from sleep to awareness. Just, awake. Eyes open in total darkness. I lay there, listening. I didn't know what had woken me, but my body was tense. I glanced at the glowing dial of my watch on the nightstand. 2:30 a.m. The cabin was silent. The stove had gone cold. I listened for anything outside. Nothing. Just the faint, almost imperceptible sound of water brushing against the shoreline rocks. And then I heard it. A knock. Dull. Rhythmic. Thud, a pause of several seconds, thud. It was coming from the lake. The sound was specific. Wood striking wood. I grew up around water, I knew that sound. That's what it's like when an oar is set carelessly against the side of a boat, or when it taps against the oarlock. I sat up in bed. My first thought was simple: my own boat, tied to the wooden dock, had come loose and was bumping against it. That happens if the knot's weak and a wave picks up. But there were no waves. The lake was completely still. I got up quietly, walked to the window facing the water, and carefully pulled back the edge of the curtain. The moon was nearly full, and its light washed the surface of the lake in a cold, silver glow. My aluminum boat was exactly where I left it. Motionless at the dock. The rope was taut. The knot was secure. But the sound came again. Thud. I shifted my gaze farther out, toward open water. About 100 yards from shore, directly in front of my cabin, there was a dark shape on the lake. Another boat. A simple wooden rowboat. No light. No lantern. No navigation lights. I strained my eyes. The moonlight was just enough to make out the outline. There was a person sitting inside. Alone. Sitting on the middle bench, back turned toward me. Arms lowered. Not rowing. The boat just drifted slightly, rocking on its own inertia. I couldn't understand what he was doing out there. At 2:30 in the morning, no fisherman sits in complete darkness in open water with no light. Not facing away from shore. I watched him for 10 minutes. He didn't move. At all. He looked like a mannequin someone had left behind in a boat. Then, slowly, he raised his right arm. There was an oar in his hand. He lowered it into the water. No splash. It was so smooth, so controlled, I didn't hear a thing. Then he pulled once. The boat turned. Now he was facing the cabin. Facing my window. The distance was too great to see his face, just a dark outline of head and shoulders. But I knew he was looking straight at the house. Then he started rowing toward me. Incredibly slowly. He dipped the oars into the water in a way that wouldn't ripple the surface. Pulled them in. Paused. Lifted them without touching the sides. Set them down again. It was silent rowing, the kind hunters used to approach ducks in reeds. Only he was using it to approach my house. Yard by yard, the distance closed. 80 yards. 60. I stood at the window, barely breathing, afraid to move, afraid he'd catch even the slightest motion behind the glass. My phone was on the table across the room. There was no signal out here anyway. 50 yards. I started to realize I had to do something. If he reached the dock, I'd have to go out to him. There was an axe in the mudroom. Slowly, careful not to creak the floorboards, I backed away from the window. Made my way to the door, felt along the wall, found the wooden handle, gripped it, and came back. I looked outside again. The boat had stopped. It floated about 30 yards from the dock. The man pulled the oars into the boat. I heard that dull knock again, wood against wood. He sat there. Watching the house. I don't know how much time passed. Half an hour. Maybe an hour. I stood in the dark, an axe in my hands, staring at the silhouette of a man sitting in a boat. He made no move to dock. Didn't try to approach. Just sat there. Watching. The psychological pressure was overwhelming. I felt like a fish in a tank. I knew he knew I was there. In places like this, at night, a human presence is always detectable. The faint warmth, the subtle changes in shadow, the memory of smoke from the chimney. He knew I was inside. And he knew I was trapped on that shore. The nearest road was 6 miles through dark forest. My only way out was the boat tied to the dock, which he was controlling, blocking access to open water. At one point, I caught myself wanting to grab a flashlight, shine it straight at him, shout, ask what he wanted. Break the tension. But instinct said otherwise. Don't reveal yourself. Don't give him information. Don't show fear. At some point, when the eastern sky began to lighten just slightly, he moved again. He took the oars. Turned the boat smoothly. And began rowing away from shore. Slowly. Silently. The boat dissolved into the gray of pre-dawn. I didn't leave the cabin until the sun was fully above the trees. Only when it was properly light did I open the door and step outside. The air was cold. The lake was empty. I walked down to the dock. My boat was still there. I looked out over the water where he had been. Nothing. Water erases everything. I told myself it had been a poacher. Or some local from across the lake. I tried to convince myself he'd just been checking whether the cabin was occupied, and once he realized it was, he left. I forced myself to calm down. I decided to stay one more day. Just to prove, to myself, at least, that I wasn't afraid. I walked along the shoreline to gather driftwood for a fire. The ground was covered in small pebbles. About 50 yards from the cabin, the shoreline curved inward, forming a small hidden cove, completely out of sight from my windows. I stepped down toward the water. And stopped. On the damp sand, right at the edge of the lake, there was a deep groove. A mark left by the bow of a boat being dragged onto shore. Next to it, boot prints. Rubber boots. The tracks led from the water into the brush. Curved around it. Headed toward my cabin. I followed them. They moved across dry grass, carefully avoiding patches where a clear impression could be left. They approached the cabin from the blind side, the wall with no windows. Circled it. And stopped directly beneath my bedroom window. The grass there was flattened. Someone had stood there. For a long time. A very long time. I looked at the lake. Then at the tracks. Then at the flattened grass. And the pieces came together in my head with sickening clarity. The man in the boat wasn't alone. The one sitting out on the water, in front of my cabin, watching the windows, he was just a decoy. He held my attention. Kept me at the window, focused on him. While the second one came ashore silently in that hidden cove. Approached the cabin from behind. The second one stood under my window the entire time. While I gripped the axe and stared out at the lake. He heard my footsteps when I walked to the mudroom. He stood a few feet away from me, separated by nothing but a thin wooden wall. I packed my things in 10 minutes. Started the motor on my boat. Left at full speed. I never went back. I sold the place 6 months later. Because every time I close my eyes, I understand something. They weren't trying to rob me. They were studying me. Watching how I reacted. And I don't know if they finished what they started. Or if they just paused. That's all for today. If you made it this far, thank you for staying. Before you go, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read them to get a sense of who else is awake at these hours. It also helps the channel grow and tells the algorithm these stories matter. If you enjoyed it, leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next video.